So in this module, we have been discussing the important role played by military force and the organized use of military force, say by armies and militaries, in the construction of political orders between and within states. We also talked about the insecurities associated with the coercion dilemma. These conversations about military force inevitably lead to questions about the origins of war. We want to discuss them a bit in this segment, presenting a broad framework that can help us understand some of the conditions that contribute to the outbreak of any war. This segment reinforces the textbook reading assigned as part of this module. Now, the literature in political science on this question about the origins of war has really settled on a basic theoretical understanding over the last decade or so. This framework is something called the bargaining model of war. Now, this perspective starts with an assumption that then motivates an important puzzle. The assumption is simple. All wars are costly. I need you to remember that. All wars are costly. This means that wars impose net costs on all of their participants. You can think about these costs in a number of ways. There are the human and moral costs associated with killing people. There are the economic costs that get paid when the infrastructure of an economy, like roads, factories, railroads, and airports, get destroyed. And there are economic costs that show up as opportunity costs in an economy, which are simply lost opportunities to make more money. For example, trade halts and markets get disrupted in wartime. Soldiers might be conscripted and lose the opportunity to raise their incomes by starting a new business or earning steady wages in a factory. Now, the reality that all wars are costly is then used to motivate a puzzle. And you can think about this in the following terms. Imagine that we represent the wealth of two economies or two countries with a pie. Now, we do that in this figure with the representation on the left of the entire combined gross domestic product of the Iraqi and Kuwaiti economies in 1989, before they fight a war triggered by Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in the summer of 1990. Now, the slice on the left in green here represents the Iraqi economy, and the slice on the right in red represents the size of the Kuwaiti economy in 1989. So next, imagine that the political conflict that activates that war is triggered by a disagreement over how the pie, these economic opportunities, should be divided between the two sides. In the Kuwait War, Iraq and Kuwait disagreed over oil rights in territory bordering the two countries. Now remember, war is costly. This means that the act of war destroys some part of the pie. The destruction of some portion of the pie then leaves a smaller portion of the pie to be divided among the contending parties. Now, the right-hand side of the figure here shows how much of the economic pie in these two countries was destroyed by war. It indicates the combined GDPs of Kuwait and Iraq in 1991 as a proportion of their GDP in 1989. Now, these costs of war show up in the blue and purple portions of the pie, which is the GDP that these countries respectively lost from their 1989 levels to the dramatically smaller economies in 1991. So again here on the left, this is the Iraqi pie, right? And so this is the Iraqi GDP in 1991, and this is the amount of GDP that Iraq lost from 1989 to 1991. Similarly, right, this is the Kuwaiti GDP in 1989 in 1991, and then this is the amount of GDP that Kuwait lost over the period from 1989 to 1991 because of that war. All right, so because war imposes costs on all of its participants, there should be some peace settlement. This is really important. There should be some peace settlement that leaves all parties better off than if they had gone to war. Peace leaves a bigger pie to be divided. In terms of this figure, it's the pie on the left-hand side of the figure, which means that both sides should be better off. They have more to consume if they can jointly figure out how not to destroy some portion of the pie. Again, in this Iraq-Kuwait war case, they would have access to these blue and purple regions of wealth if they could have simply found a compromise in the summer of 1990 that would have avoided the costs of war. So given this possibility that peace creates some dividend that leaves all parties better off, the puzzle of why wars occur is the following. Why can't warring states or groups identify and honor indefinitely some peace settlement or some pre-war division of the pie that avoids the costs of war and leaves both sides better off? In short, an understanding of why war occurs rests on understanding the factors that prevent competing organizations from reaching a peace settlement that would leave everyone better off. Now, there are two prominent answers to this question. We're going to spend very little time on the first, but I just want to discuss it briefly as it often helps us understand short wars or minor skirmishes. The presence of something called private information or uncertainty about things like the distribution of military power between sides or the willingness of an adversary to pay the costs of war, something that we describe as resolve. So the presence of private information can lead to war by encouraging at least one side to overestimate its bargaining leverage. In these situations, one party overestimates its military strength and then fails to make sufficient concessions to the other side to preserve peace. You might think of this mechanism as a story about being too greedy. A state can capture some benefit by avoiding the costs of war, but it mistakenly demands too much, provokes the adversary, and ends up paying the costs that it could have avoided. Now, the second explanation for a bargaining failure and war stems from something called the commitment problem. You might think of the commitment problem as reflecting the difficulties of contracting over time. You make a deal with someone today to deliver a set of promises or goods a year from now. You understand that their willingness to abide by those terms in a year might change. So the fear that your opponent will demand new concessions in the future or violate his obligations in the future then inhibits you from constructing that deal in the present. So states will also go to war if they think that any peace deal struck with an adversary to avoid the costs of war is simply not sustainable. For example, some parties could worry that an adversary might use a period of peace created from a ceasefire to strengthen their military and then demand more concessions in the future from a strengthened bargaining position. Under these conditions, a state will fight now to avoid being military weaker in the future and then having to make a new set of political concessions in the future in that weakened condition. Now, one of the principal sources of a commitment problem is a rapid and large shift in the distribution of military or political power between two sides. So let me say this again. Commitment problems and the wars that follow from them stem from shifts in the distribution of power between contending sides in a dispute. Why? This growth in power encourages the rising side to demand, in the future, revisions to any political settlement made in the present. Thus, they might make a deal in 2025 over some distribution of territory and then ask for more territorial concessions in the year 2030. The side that is growing stronger can probably extract these concessions in 2030 because they will have a greater likelihood of defeating their adversary in the war then. Right? This shows up as a favorable shift in the distribution of military power. Because, right, remember, that adversary is going to want to try and avoid the costs of war in 2030 as well. So faced with the possibility of a future of more political concessions, the declining side or state might opt for war in the year 2025. In 2025, they have a greater chance of military victory and destroying the future military threat before it's fully realized. So this is called a commitment problem for the following reason. Peace in 2025 could be created by a commitment or by a promise made by the rising state in 2025 not to demand future concessions in 2030. The dilemma or the commitment problem stems from the fact that any promise made in 2025 from a position of temporary weakness might simply not be credible. If a side that's getting stronger can break a promise in 2030 without cost, then why should its adversary make that peace settlement that avoids the costs of war in 2025? So in the commitment problem story, the two sides can identify a fair deal in the present, in the year 2025, in this hypothetical that we've been discussing. However, their fears that such a deal will not be sustainable into the future leads them to fight a war in the present. So in sum, this segment has used something called the bargaining framework to identify two common sets of causes of war. Both explain the outbreak of war in terms of the failure of two sides with conflicting political interests to reach some settlement of the issue in dispute that both sides would have an interest in preserving indefinitely. We discussed two sources of these bargaining failures. The first stems from something called private information, uncertainty over things like the distribution of military power between two sides or the relative willingness of the two sides to sustain the costs of war, leads one of the two sides to overestimate its bargaining leverage in a dispute. Then they fail to make sufficient concessions during peace talks, and the other side opts for war to secure more of the issue in dispute. The second source of bargaining failure in war is the commitment problem. Commitment problems are caused by rapid and large shifts in the distribution of power between two sides in a dispute. The declining side opts to fight a war in the present because it fears that the rising side will use military threats to pressure it into making new political concessions in the future. Peace could be sustained if the rising side could commit indefinitely to uphold or honor any compromise settlement.